Hi again then guys, and welcome to the second instalment of Beards and Cars, the more informal series on the channel, kind of a podcast style format with some racing action in the background, which you guys seem to enjoy quite a bit in the last video. So I tried to keep the racing as interesting as possible in that last video as well, and also more so in this one. I had to actually remove a lot of the upgrades, especially with regard to power on the Daytona Cobra which I'm driving, in order to keep the race interesting, because of course, as many of you guys will experience as well, the AI on GT6 isn't necessarily the most skilled, and you can actually leave them behind quite quickly. I found that in fully tuned form my Daytona was getting to first place within say 30 seconds or so it wasn't really an exciting race. So we reduced it down. It's got about 400 horsepower instead, so it makes it much more interesting, a much better battle, especially when you're up against 500, 600, 700 horsepower race cars, or say 600 in the case of some of these. Now, this particular episode is going to be slightly different from the last one, because of course I covered some ground rules, some very vague open ones for this series, wherein it's not as structured or as form-fitted as some of the others. Some of my videos are strictly for reviewing cars, some are strictly for tuning cars, some are strictly for comparing cars, and other things in there as well. Whereas this is much more informal and doesn't really have that same kind of structure, and the stuff that you can talk about can be wildly varied compared to the previous video, the next video, etc. Now, there were a couple of things which I planned to talk about, as I mentioned in the first episode, but it ended up that I was just talking about GT Sport and how it compared to other Gran Turismo games. For this particular installment, I had a couple of other things which I wanted to talk about instead. Not necessarily unimportant things, but more opinion-based things, because obviously Gran Turismo Sport is the hotly anticipated next thing in the GT franchise. Of course, people are talking about it, people are anticipating it, so it's a hot button subject, whereas the stuff which I'm talking about in this episode, and of course you can see the time markers down below in the description to skip to a topic, are a bit different to that. And the first thing that I wanted to talk about was actually a piece of car news, and it's a piece of news which some of you guys will definitely have already heard about, but this particular piece of news was about Spyker. Now, I love the brand of Spyker. I also like Koenigsegg a lot as well. I don't love Koenigsegg though. It's one of those companies that I respect more than I love. I love companies such as Spyker, Pagani, and various companies like that which are similar to Koenigsegg in that they are boutique manufacturers. They make cars on a much more personal level. They don't have mass production schedules. They make cars which feel much more like a family business, like the old days of a guy building a car in his shed, but with much higher quality, better tech, and more safety than they used to have. Now, Spyker is a brand which has had some interesting dealings with other companies, other marques, other manufacturers over the years. They've had dealings with Saab, for instance. They've had dealings with military aspects of commercial sales, if you will, way back in the day when they made aeroplanes, I believe it was, if I remember correctly. And now Spyker is actually in kind of a business relationship with Koenigsegg, because, as I said, some of you guys will have probably heard, but Koenigsegg is now providing Spyker with some engines on a production scale, a limited production scale of course, but a scale nonetheless, for, I believe it was the Preliator, the new Spyker which debuted as a concept car recently. And I believe it was a newer version of the Preliator, because I saw, if it wasn't the Preliator, it must have been the Venator at Goodwood a couple of years back. Fantastic looking car, the first car I've ever seen to have leather panels on the outer bodywork, which was kind of a weird feature. Certainly wouldn't want to drive it in the rain. But this particular model is, I have to be honest, one of my less liked Spyker models. I prefer the models like the La Voilette or the Aileron. I prefer those cars, that more classic Spyker look. It's the way I know them, it's the way they debuted in modern times, and that's what I'm used to. Whereas these newer cars for me don't have just that certain spark to them. But speaking of spark, the engines in particular that Koenigsegg build are incredible. in the 1-to-1, the Agera, the CCXR, various other models, they've always had fantastic engines, which, especially for their comparative size, being generally between 4.6 to around 5 litres in capacity, which is relatively small for a supercar. There are certainly many which are bigger than that, actually produce huge figures in terms of power, torque, and of course performance. But they're also engines which you don't hear bad things about. You don't hear about Koenigsegg's breaking down. You hear about people crashing them, obviously, but you rarely, if ever, hear about reliability issues with Koenigsegg engines. And now they are in a relationship with Spyker, I believe it was, as I said, in particular for the Preliator, where they are supplying them with, I believe it was a 5-litre V8 system. And it's an engine which is rated to put out up to 1500 horsepower competently. So in other words, it's designed to cope with even more than that, but it can cope with that safely and reliably. They've used it to produce 1360 horsepower in the 1-to-1, but in the case of Spyker, they've slightly respec'd the engine to produce 600 horsepower straight out of the box, naturally aspirated. That's very impressive. For a 5-litre engine to have 600 horsepower with no turbo, no supercharger, that's good territory to be working in. Especially being a V8. V8s are smoother and they give a good balance between the smoothness of something like a V12 or a V16, because for those who don't know, the more cylinders you have in an engine, the less time there is between power strokes, and so the smoother it runs. So with a V8, you kind of get that advantage, but without having as many components as a V10, a V12, a V16, and obviously not the sheer mass of the engine that you would typically have in a big V16. It doesn't have the complexity of a V12, and it just means that a V10 isn't really required. Obviously in some cars you could have those other engine options, and they're great. They all have their own characteristics. But a V8 is the most popular engine in the world for a reason. It's a good middle ground. It gives you great reliability if you build them properly, but also great performance range. And you see V8s in everything from trucks that are designed to carry logs all day to supercars. The McLaren P1, the Chevy Corvette, and everything in between uses V8 engines. Now the V8 isn't my favourite engine, but it is a very strong choice of engine, and Koenigsegg clearly knows what they're doing when it comes to building performance cars, performance engines, and it's great to see that Spyker will now be using those engines in at least that one particular model. So it would be cool to see where it goes from there. Now you can get, of course, more info on the net about the engine, its torque, its revs, all that kind of thing. I think peak power was at around 8,000 RPM, which is pretty good. It's an engine that likes to be worked, and 600 horsepower is certainly more than enough for a Spyker. They typically don't have anywhere near that kind of power. You're looking at 400 or 500, and for a Spyker that's perfect, because they were never designed really to be the fastest, just like Pagani. It's another reason why I love them. They've never been about being the best at any particular thing. They're more about being the best at being unique. And Spykers really are unique. They are like pieces of art, as far as I'm concerned. And there are very few cars which I would say are like pieces of art. I would say that Spykers are, I would say that the Maserati MC12 is, and Paganis are, especially the Zonda, but of course also the Huayra. Now that's basically the first subject that I wanted to discuss. As far as the next one, this is one which I'd like to hear the thoughts of you guys on as well. Not that I didn't for that one, of course, but this one's more of a general conversation or a general question, and that is what your favourite car games are. You've got your more obvious choices, not that those are bad, of course. Sometimes the obvious choice is obvious for a reason. It's because it's good. And I would put two, of course, above all else in that category: Forza and Gran Turismo. They are the titans of their respective brand, and they have massive followings. Obviously, people would argue one against the other, which one's better, which one you should and shouldn't play. Personally, play both. Why choose? But if you do have to choose, it depends on the kind of driver you are, it depends what kind of game you prefer. I would say that the way I see it is that Gran Turismo and Forza both have a similar way of thinking in one particular way, although they approach it from opposite directions. And that is that many racing games are specialised for one particular thing. The TOCA games, for instance, they're very geared towards making you think like a manager. You think about planning the season, where you need to finish in races, what team you should be using, what kind of livery, what kind of car. That's very much what the TOCA games give off an aura of. It's kind of about the business of racing. Then you have others like Need for Speed, or I would say Midnight Club as well, where it's basically 100% about the fun, and realism doesn't really matter. Of course there is some realism in there. The cars act like cars to more or less of a degree, but they're more about the fun. And they do well on that, that's why people love them. They're kind of like the game equivalents of the Fast and Furious franchise. You don't watch Fast and Furious if you're a car guy. You watch it if you want to see cars doing stuff which real cars can't do, and which, to be fair, would insult anyone who is an actual car guy, because it's ridiculous, the stuff that cars do. AKA 17 gear changes, and you're doing 120 miles per hour in a Skyline, which is supposedly upgraded to around 500 horsepower. Yeah, that's realistic. Oh wait, no it isn't. Need for Speed and Midnight Club are similar in that regard. They try more to be entertaining and fun rather than realistic, and that works for them. I would say that Midnight Club 3 Dub Edition, in particular the remix, is one of my favourite racing games of all time, because it was such a great mix of everything. It had fantastic, and I mean fantastic cars. There are still cars on Midnight Club 3, in particular the remix, that I've never seen on any other racing game. Stuff like some of the Gembala models, such as the Gembala F355, the Gembala 996 Turbo, the Gembala Porsche Cayenne. You had cars like the Chrysler ME412. That's barely on any racing game anymore. Forza 2 used to have it, Test Drive Unlimited had it, Project Gotham may have had it, I'm not sure, probably not. But hardly any games, if any, have the Chrysler ME412 anymore. So those games have their merits, they really do. And then you've got games which I think are more about short-term entertainment. They don't really have as much to keep you playing them, but they're certainly a nice distraction from the slugging through career mode of games like TOCA, Gran Turismo, Forza, AC, Project Cars, those kind of ones. And I would say games such as Driver, or Stunt Driver, or Le Mans 24 Hours, those kind of games which sometimes fade more into obscurity, or I would say one of my personal favourite examples, which I've just remembered in that category, is a franchise known as Runabout. Some of you guys have probably played Runabout on the PS1, the PS2. I love that game franchise. I played, I think it was Runabout 2 and Runabout 3. Never played the first one though, and those games are amazing. The graphics don't hold up at all, but the gameplay is so fun. In fact, I even did a review of Runabout 3 on the channel. You can find it in my game review playlist. But those games, like Driver, like Runabout, those kind of games, and kind of Grand Theft Auto as well, but although that does it on a much more successful scale, they use cars, for want of a better word, as a vehicle to put forward kind of a playground feeling to the game. It's a very big open world where it gives you the impression that you can pretty much do whatever you want. Grand Theft Auto is the epitome of that, although personally I've never had any interest in Grand Theft Auto, but others such as Runabout and Driver, they also have that. Test Drive Unlimited tried to, and for the most part it did succeed with the open world aspect, but where Test Drive Unlimited differs, at least for me of course, is that the driving itself was a little bit more focused on racing and burning through career mode and buying the cars, whereas stuff like Runabout or Driver doesn't really have that as much. They're more on the pure fun side of things. And Driver San Francisco, for instance, is one of my favourite driving games ever. I think it's a fantastic open world driving game, and some of the car physics on that game, such as the tyre smoke, the way the driver's hands are on the steering wheel, the way he actually presses the horn when you press the horn, the way that when you turn corners he rotates one hand on the steering wheel, the way when he reverses he opens his fingers and puts his palm on the wheel, which actual driving involves. That's what you do. That's just what people naturally do without thinking. Those little things thrown in there just give the game a feeling of uniqueness, and it gives you a reason to go back, because very few other games offer that same kind of quirkiness. Others are quirky for sure, like Runabout, but didn't necessarily do well from it. Stuff like Le Mans 24 Hour, which I mentioned earlier, or games which are really awful, I would say, like GTR 400 or GT Racers. I don't know if any of you guys have played those games on the PS2, but they are awful. Like some of the worst driving games I've ever played. It's like driving a box with a number on the side. They just don't hold up at all. The tracks are basically either one city track or one country track, or infinite variations of them which look exactly the same. And I think probably the worst racing game I've ever played, which I would put in that same kind of overly specialised category, is actually a game, I believe it was called Corvette. And that was it. And it was like every Corvette ever made was on the game. It had something like 120 cars, and they were just Corvettes. Now the idea of that is awesome. Imagine if Gran Turismo had every Corvette ever made, every variation of it. That sounds like the kind of thing that Gran Turismo would do, but this game actually did it. And because they focus just on Corvettes, in a similar way to games like Ford Racing totally focuses on Ford, or Ford versus Chevy, which I also own, focuses just on those two brands, and various others as well, like Ferrari Challenge, the way that they focused in on that one brand allowed them to have a total monopoly on that niche. Unfortunately for games like those, they tend to be executed really badly. So although they have great car choices, the graphics usually suck, the audio is pathetic, the handling physics are, well, what handling physics, and the racing tends to be very repetitive and very monotonous. Whereas games which have a balance of everything, not surprisingly, tend to end up being more popular. Stuff like Gran Turismo, Forza, even to some degree ones like TOCA, Test Drive, Drive Club even. Drive Club, I would say, is a very good example of a game which goes more for fun than realism, though it has just enough realism to keep someone who's maybe a Forza or Gran Turismo fan interested for longer. Plus, that game has fantastic car choice. Some cars on that game which I've never seen on any other as well. Now, moving more specifically to my personal favourite car games, I've kind of touched on a couple. I would say that Driver San Francisco is definitely one of my favourites. If you're talking purely fun of driving, yeah, that's way up there. As far as pure fun, I would say Need for Speed Carbon in particular is probably one of my favourites purely for fun, but I think overall, if I'm just going to play a car game totally for mindless fun, it would have to be Midnight Club 3 Dub Edition Remix. That is just the epitome of a fun overall car game. In-depth customization, great car choice, any game which mixes cars and motorbikes together instantly gets my attention. That's why I love Test Drive Unlimited, that's why I like Project Gotham more than it deserves to be liked, because the career mode in that game and the track choice is woefully lacking. But any game which combines the two really appeals to me. And I know that most, probably, of you guys on the channel don't care as much for motorbikes. And I would say I do prefer cars to motorbikes, though I love both. That means that from a financial point of view, those games tend to not necessarily be worse because of having bikes, but I don't think it makes a huge difference, because most people who buy racing games buy car racing games, and if you're going to buy bikes, you just buy MotoGP or Tourist Trophy or something like that. Now, I love bikes, and unfortunately there aren't really enough bike games to justify having like a top 10 list of them. There are more than 10, but good ones? Well, that would be hard to populate a list. I would say Tourist Trophy is my favourite motorbike game, purely for motorbikes, and of course, for those who are unfamiliar with it, it was made by Polyphony, and it is the Gran Turismo of bike games. Specifically, it was for the PS2, and it is the Gran Turismo 4 of motorbike games. You've got a huge amount of bikes to choose from. The tracks are almost all available on Gran Turismo 4, with a couple of exclusives like the Paul Ricard circuit, I believe, was on there, and a couple of others which are exclusive to the game. And if you are a fan of bikes and you haven't checked it out, because this is of course kind of a side note, I would definitely recommend checking that out. But as far as the more popular side of racing games, the big dogs, such as Gran Turismo and Forza, once you get into that territory, it becomes harder to narrow down a favourite. I've mentioned in the previous episode that I believe Gran Turismo 4 is the best all-round Gran Turismo game to date. Gran Turismo 5 is great, but it was similar to GT4, and the fact that GT4 did it earlier would give it the edge for me. Plus you had to buy a PS3 to get Gran Turismo 5, whereas the PS2 was a lot cheaper, which again means that the value for money is through the roof. And of course Gran Turismo 3 is a very popular one. Personally, I never got into it that much. I would say that my favourite Gran Turismo game would actually have to be Gran Turismo 2 though, because not only is it where it started for me, back when I was about 7 years old, but the all-round feeling that the game has, even not talking about nostalgia, but just the way it's laid out in general, the kind of expansive career mode that you have, the cars that were on that game. I would say the car selection, for instance, on GT2 is possibly the best range of cars that we've ever had on Gran Turismo. Because if you think of cars now on the game, we've basically been sticking to the same format that we've had since Gran Turismo 4, which is some great Le Mans cars, a couple of great supercars, and dozens and dozens of MX-5s, Skylines, Civics, S2000s, all that kind of thing. Now, I don't hate them for that. It's totally pointless, but I don't hate them for it. It's the running joke of Gran Turismo. But back on Gran Turismo 3 even, it didn't feel like that. Gran Turismo 3 had less cars, for instance. I think they had about 300 cars on there. And the reason for that was because, like Gran Turismo 5, Gran Turismo 3 was a jump to a new console. So often, with Forza as well, you see the game get pared back a little bit, limited in scope, so that they can focus on increasing the quality of the individual vehicles more. And that's a great thing. It can seem to be annoying at the time, but when you understand why it happened, you can justify it, really. Now, Gran Turismo 2, well, that's a totally different ballgame. Gran Turismo 2 combines, if you haven't played it, the open world feeling of, say, Gran Turismo 4 or Gran Turismo 5 to some degree, but not as much, with a selection of car types that I would argue we've never had since. Gran Turismo 4 had a good mix, a very good mix, but Gran Turismo 2 had cars which not only have never been featured since, and some of you guys know, my favourite was the Espace F1, but there were other great cars as well, Vectors, Venturis, the Lotus Elise GT1, the Esprit GT1, the Suzuki Cultus, Pikes Peak, various other cars which have never been featured on the game since. But it's not just about those cars, it's about the stuff which is just everyday cars. Stuff like the Ford Puma or the Cougar. Cars which aren't on Gran Turismo anymore. They haven't been for a long time. They're cars which people probably wouldn't really request that much. But when you actually see those cars on a game, and I don't know about you guys, I'd be interested to see if you agree with this point, but for me, when I see cars on a game that are normal, just everyday cars that you could see, well, every day, and having the opportunity to race those against typical gaming cars with the tuning that you'd have in a racing game, there's just something innately appealing about that to me. To have those cars which are normal and then make them stupid, make them insanely quick around the track or totally unrealistically fast in a straight line, and race them against cars which they'd never even be parked next to in real life, let alone race against, like a Renault Laguna racing against a Ford GT90, because that's never going to happen in real life. But on Gran Turismo 2, it can. And not only that, you could take your Renault Laguna, you could take it to the tuning shop, and you could turn it into a Renault Laguna BTCC touring car. For 50 grand or whatever it cost back then, you could literally turn a road car into a race car. And I know that those of you who have played Gran Turismo 2 will undoubtedly miss that great feature as much as I do. What do we have now? Well, we kind of have race equivalents to that. Like on Gran Turismo 5 you could get race conversions like the Tuscan touring car, and now it's been integrated into the game more where it doesn't feel as special. On GT6 you can fit some body kits and wings, but it just doesn't have that feeling that Gran Turismo 2 had, where you could take a Ford Taurus in and turn it into a full-on NASCAR, or you could take in the Renault Laguna, for instance, that I already mentioned, or I believe you could do it with an Audi A4 as well, or even a Volvo, and you could turn it into a BTCC spec licensed touring car. How cool is that? We don't do that anymore. And one of the reasons why we don't is because we don't even have those cars on the game anymore. So even if you had that option, you wouldn't be able to use it. Not on those, at least. Now, of course, nostalgia plays a big part, but overall, I would say that Gran Turismo 2 is my favourite Gran Turismo game. And for now, we'll probably have to leave the Forza side of things for another video. I do plan to talk about that as well, because Forza was a later entry for me in my racing life, if you will, of gaming. And I have a lot of love for Forza as well. I played through them in a similar way to the way that I progressed through the Gran Turismo games. But for now, that's pretty much it for this episode. We didn't have a huge amount of subjects to talk through, but more than the first one. And as I mentioned, I would love to hear the thoughts of you guys on these points down below as well. But I'll see you guys next time, and for now, thanks for watching.